Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is an honor for me to make a contribution to this landmark piece of legislation. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, from what the last speaker said, let me guarantee Guyana that this is the right government that is bringing this bill to the House. I must congratulate the government of Guyana and the Ministry of Health for bringing this bill to this House at this time. Mr. Speaker, transplants are not new. In fact, the technique of skin harvesting and transplantation was initially described approximately 2,500 to 3,000 years ago in India, in which skin grafting was used to reconstruct noses that were amputated as a means of judicial punishment. The earliest known blood transfusion occurred in 1665, and the first human blood transfusion was performed in 1795. The first transfusion of human blood for the treatment of hemorrhage was performed by Dr. Blundell in London in 1818. Mr. Speaker, organ transplants were an important step in medical history. They provided a new way to help people suffering from organ failure or incurable diseases. By donating organs and tissue after death, a donor can save or improve as many as 75 lives. Many families say that knowing their loved ones helps save or improve other people's lives, help them to cope with their loss. A transplant is an organ, tissue, or group of cells removed from one person who is deemed to be the donor and transplanted into another person, the recipient, or moved from one site to another in the same person. Many different types of organs, tissue, cells, and limbs can be transplanted. Nowadays, Mr. Speaker, the question is more about which organ cannot be transplanted than which can be transplanted. However, Mr. Speaker, with organ transplant came the need for regulation and laws to protect both the donor and the recipient. Provisions with regard to organ and tissue donation and transplantation have been developed in countries across the world with a focus to protect the potential donor and also in some countries to prevent the threatening problem of organ trafficking. There are simply more or less severe limitations in the living donor procurement and transplantation activities which are consequently regulated by law in these countries. The World Health Organization, the United Nations Specialized Agency for Health, has adopted in the World Health Assembly in 1991 the guiding principles for human organ transplant, Resolution WHA 4013, which have had a great influence on professional codes and legislations. These principles emphasize voluntary donation, non-commercialization, and the preference for deceased donors over living donors, and for genetically related donors over non-related donors. 22nd May 2004, the 57th World Health Assembly adopted the Resolution 5718 concerning human organ and tissue transplantation, recommending notably the extension of the use of living donors in addition to deceased donors, and to make measures to protect the poorest and vulnerable groups from transplant tourism and the sale of tissues and organs, including attention to the wider problem of international trafficking in human tissues and organs. Mr. Speaker, these guidelines are totally encapsulated in the bill that is being presented today by our Honorable Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, transplants can be done from a living donor to a recipient, from a deceased donor to a living recipient, from a donor to a donor himself or herself, as in the case of skin transplants and autotransfusions. Mr. Speaker, not so long ago, We had a xenotransplantation, the newest innovation that bioengineer organs and tissues in an animal, such as a pig, and then use it for human transplantation. Mr. Speaker, this has already been done. Guyana has now at last come to the Parliament with a comprehensive legislation regarding human organ and tissue transplantation. This bill number 19 of 2021 marks Guyana's entry into the list of countries that now have legislation in this area. Mr. Speaker, transplants are done in several countries around the world. Kidney transplants done in 102 countries, liver transplant in about 78 countries, heart transplants in 59 countries, lung in 44 countries, pancreas in 45 countries, small bowel transplants in 15 countries. Complete face transplant has also become possible in 2021, and so far 45 has actually been successfully done. Mr. Speaker, Guyana has long been doing blood transfusions. I'm not sure on the date when we really start, but when the first transfusion was done, that is, bearing in mind that blood transfusion is actually fluid transplant. Mr. Speaker, this legislation now regulates even blood transfusion, taking into account the donor as well as the recipient, because we know in a country like ours, we have some people who may not and who, for different reasons, do not want to have a blood transfusion, and their rights also have to be respected, and it is respected in this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like the Honorable Minister said, 2008 was a landmark year for Guyana. Prior to 2008, we could not have even dreamt that in that year, we would have started organ transplant in Guyana. But, Mr. Speaker, we did. We started doing organ transplants. To date, Mr. Speaker, we have completed a number of kidney and corneal transplants. Thanks to and kudos need to be given to those brilliant sons and daughters of Guyana who are involved in these activities, who have grabbed the opportunity to study, to elevate themselves, to become real doctors in the sense that they could now compete with first world countries in doing transplants. And Mr. Speaker, the transplants that have been done in Guyana so far, the results that we are getting are not less than what the first world people are getting. So kudos again, Mr. Speaker, to the brilliant, hardworking, dedicated doctors who are bringing first world medicine to Guyana. So, sir, from just blood transfusion, Guyana has joined the ranks of other countries in doing organ transplants, including kidney transplant, skin grafting in the burns unit, corneal transplants. Kudos to these talented, gifted doctors. Sir, Guyana is led by a team of persons who make dreams come true, not only in the housing, but also in medicine. The team that is leading Guyana make dreams become a reality. So I say, in terms of tissue and cell transplant, the three main ones are corneal graft, which Guyana has already developed a capacity for which Dr. Sugrim and team are moving to make routine in Guyana. Mr. Speaker, the second one is transplantation of hematopoietic stem cells to cure congenital or acquired diseases, including things like leukemia. This is an area Guyana would want to develop in a center of excellence, hopefully in the not too distant future. Mr. Speaker, the third is transplantation of heart valves. This is another area that we hope would come on board soon. In the WHO resolution, countries agreed that the right to health include the right to transplant medicine, Mr. Speaker. Guyana is amongst only a handful of developing countries on the path to fully realize this right. We are not anywhere near of a full transplant program as yet, Mr. Speaker, but this bill allows us to contemplate the full possibility. It opens the doors to the future of transplant in Guyana. Mr. Speaker, so then, Why can't we begin to think about our first liver and heart and lung transplant? This bill says to our people that we think we can. We are preparing the legal groundwork, the legal framework for these things to happen, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like I said, we dream big, and the PPP civic government fulfills dreams. When we established the Public Health Laboratory, Reference Laboratory in 2008, we were thinking of a laboratory that has the capacity to support high-end medicine like transplants. The lab did not develop in the way we originally planned over the period of 5 years, but we are returning to the original plan that we had. The lab is now being equipped for sequence testing, and that will enable us to establish genotypes. Thus, we could test for variants soon. But we are also looking to develop an internationally certified cross-matching lab. This is part of our collaboration with world-class partners such as McMaster, Mount Sinai, Nortel, and Harvard. Mr. Speaker, the PPP civic government is not only talking the talk, we are also walking the walk, as could be seen with this bill. As a medical practitioner, myself, practicing medicine, transplant and transfusion are blessings, Mr. Speaker. They provide to the patient what was previously not available. For the medical fraternity, Mr. Speaker, we look at this with optimism. There is an exciting future that this bill caters for. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, like the minister pointed out, imagine being able to replace diseased organs, non-functional organs, with organs that are functioning. Mr. Speaker, this is a modern bill. It encapsulates the experiences of other countries. It encapsulates the guidelines of the World Health Organization. So, Mr. Speaker, the minister is heading a team, and the minister has referred to all those persons who contributed to this bill. It has been a long time in the making, Mr. Speaker, and there should be no further delay. This bill has to be passed here today so that we could move forward. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the honorable member, and I was wondering whether she really read the bill or whether she glanced through. Because she mentioned, the honorable member mentioned about the real debt to be ascertained. Mr. Speaker, the bill clearly states when death occurs. A person is considered dead when there has occurred A, irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions of that person, or B, irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem of that person. 2, death shall be determined by 2 medical practitioners on the staff of the designated hospital, except that A, a medical practitioner who has a familial or professional relationship with the proposed recipient shall not take any part in the determination of the fact of the death of the donor of the organ, tissue, cell, or fluid. B, a medical practitioner who had taken part in the determination of death under paragraph A shall not participate in the transplantation of the organ, tissue, cell, or fluid to the recipient. And C, where the organ, tissue, cell, or fluid is to be removed to be used for therapeutic purposes, medical education, or scientific research, a medical practitioner who is due to remove or transplant the organ, tissue, cell, or fluid shall not determine the occurrence of death, nor be a part of any team or process by whom or which death is determined. And 3, the minister shall, by regulations, prescribe the criteria for determining the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem of a person referred to in subsection 1. So, Minister, it is quite clear, it is quite comprehensive. The other one I'd like to point out, Mr. Speaker, is the issue with minor. The honorable member also mentioned a concern about minor. And I just read from the bill, Mr. Speaker. Donation of organ, tissue, cell, and biofluid by minors. 24.1. For the purposes of approving a donation by a minor under this part, an independent assessment committee shall be established by the Chief Medical Officer or Director of Medical Services of the designated hospital where the donated organ, tissue, cell, or biofluid shall be procured for transplantation. 2, the Independent Assessment Committee shall have a minimum of 3 members, one of whom shall be a designated officer, and one of whom shall be a psychologist or psychiatrist. 3, a person who has had any association with the donor or the proposed recipient that might influence the person's judgment shall not be a member of the Independent Assessment Committee. Mr. Speaker, this bill caters to the rights of the minor. You have a psychologist, psychiatrist there to look at what the honorable member said, the body language, to evaluate the minor. Mr. Speaker, as far as I'm concerned, this bill includes all that needs to be done, including penalties, Mr. Speaker, including deterrence or transplantation tourism, for example, including those who might want to go down the road of selling organs and so. It has all of that encapsulated here, Mr. Speaker. So I have no hesitation, Mr. Speaker, in supporting. It says 5 years jail if you're found guilty. Mr. Speaker, I have no hesitation in supporting this bill and in commending it to the House and in congratulating the government and the Honorable Minister of Health. Thank you.